Welcome to Want More with Dr. Moore, the criminologist of the Bay. Your host, Dr. Talia Moore, is a college professor who created this space to discuss and facilitate transformation in learning. Each week, we'll bring you dynamic leaders and change makers and discuss systems, practices, policies, and people that intersect and impact justice as we know it. And now, your host, Dr. Talia Moore.
My name is Dr. Talia Moore, and I'm your host. Today, we will be taking a pivotal look at justice reform across the country. Nationwide, we saw prosecutors ride the wave of justice reform following the murder of George Floyd. However, these same progressive prosecutors often face backlash. Think about Chesa Boudin, who was recalled from San Francisco, as well as looking at George Gaston. He faced some challenges as the district attorney in Los Angeles. And right here in Alameda County, voters recalled the first Black female district attorney elected to that position, Pamela Price. Well, today we are fortunate to have Madam Pamela Price here as our guest. Civil rights attorney, Yale graduate, former foster youth, and the first Black female elected district attorney of Alameda County. Thank you, Madam Price, for being here.
Of course. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be with you today.
Yay. Yes, yes, yes. All right, so we are going to get into the questions.
Yeah.
And I really want for you to use this platform as a voice. I know you verbalize yourself well and articulate, and sometimes, people may not be able to hear the truth. So hopefully your authenticness and anything else you got going on is going to be conveyed in today's discussion. When you were elected in 2022, you said criminal justice reform was the signature civil rights issue of our time. Do you still believe that to be so? And if so, what does that mean about our society's current state?
You're absolutely correct. In 2022, it appeared to me from a civil rights perspective, and I've been involved in criminal justice reform since I was in law school, actually before law school, but certainly from 1980s, early 1980s, understanding that the criminal justice system was broken. And so in 2022, yes, I did believe that the signature civil rights issue of our time, where we were at that time, was criminal justice reform. In 2025, we're in an entirely different situation. We are now in a fascist state. And so the signature civil rights issue of our time is whether we are going to have any civil rights. It involves our United States Constitution. And as a lawyer who swore to defend and uphold the Constitution, that's the signature issue right now. It's both our First Amendment, our Fourth Amendment rights, our rights, birthright citizenship is something that has come to the fore. Donald Trump's entry into the executive powers has changed the entire dynamic. And I think when we got to the election in 2024, people did not realize we were about to slide into fascism. And so what happened in 24 was just part of the floodgates. And the society and the issues now have been completely turned upside down.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, and I wish I could argue otherwise, but unfortunately, the truth, even when it's not truthfully told, is displaying itself.
Right.
Kind of speaking about just different administrations, I want to kind of go back a little bit in time, not to the pandemic, but right afterwards, right? When we're thinking about, your administration just kind of coming in, how was that transition, and what did you inherit in that role, and how were you able to implement reforms in response?
Sure. I came into office in early 2023, and what we found when we got there was that the DA's office was still recovering, and the court system generally was still recovering from the impact of COVID. There was a huge backlog of cases. The DA's office was particularly understaffed, which we attribute to some people leaving in COVID. There was just a lot of, it's almost like they got stuck in time pre-COVID because there wasn't enough of an advance after COVID to kind of catch up. And so we got there were backlogs, there were staffing shortages, there was a lot of of displaced or delayed, I guess, neglected infrastructure that we had to build up. And so we really had to focus on the infrastructure. And as a businesswoman, I ran a business, a successful business for 30 years. And so I understood what a law firm needs to be able to function efficiently and provide the services. And so that was our focus. They were not efficient. They were not very advanced in terms of technology. The case management systems were outdated and underutilized and confusing. A lot of delayed maintenance in the facilities, in addition to just some really backward practices with respect to how employees were treated.
Sounds like you had your hands full.
Oh, yeah.
That position.
Absolutely.
Now, I will say that you did have a lot of support. I mean, I think it was, we could see that you had a lot of support. I know that you had the support from the ACLU and other organizations and other community groups, but you also faced opposition from within your office. Prosecutors voting for your recall, allegations of a hostile work environment, and you said you kind of walked into one, so I can, see that. But looking back, were there any early signs that you could have addressed or would address differently in hindsight?
I am part of a progressive movement of prosecutors, and one of my mentors in that movement is Larry Krasner. Is the elected district attorney of Philadelphia, one of the trailblazers of the criminal justice reform movement from a prosecutorial perspective. And one of the things Larry said to me is, you should have fired more people when you got in the door, because there's always a debate when you walk into these offices. How bad is it going to be? Is it just a few bad apples, really poison, mess up the whole bunch? And I think when we walked into the Alameda County DA's office, we knew there were some bad apples. I put some people on administrative leave once because we had the information about some things that were of concern in terms of the administration of justice. But I think that the widespreadness of the way in which the office had operated was going to be a problem. And there was no way to come in. Larry fired 30 prosecutors within his first 2 weeks. I couldn't do that because for a number of reasons, not the least of which was we saw that the office was dramatically understaffed. And when we did an office-wide survey, when we first got there, one of the main things the prosecutors and the staff said was, we need more staff. And so when you walk into an office that's understaffed, you can't start firing people. You should not start firing people without knowing what the process is to replace them. And we want to give people a chance to kind of adjust to the change in the administration. This office had not seen change in 50 years. And so we gave folks a chance, and I probably was too lenient in that respect.
Yeah. I appreciate and recognized your grace in approaching this. Yeah, for sure.
Right. I told my team, just give it a grace. There's a lot of resistance. There's a lot of complaints about nothing. But it also, we found that the office was in a traumatic state. They had 3 suicides in the previous 4 years under the prior administration. And there was a mental health group that the lawyers themselves had formed. So we supported that and really initiated and amplified the efforts to ensure that mental health and self-care was important for the people who were there, because they clearly had been neglected, had been traumatized by those suicides and some of the departures before we got there. So the office was a hot mess, and our job was to try to build it up. And yes, I said, let's give them some grace and let's see how it goes.
Yeah. So, Madam Price, critics said you were poor at explaining your policies to the public. However, your supporters said that the media was biased as soon as you stepped into your position. So, how would you respond to those statements?
I definitely agree with my supporters that the media's bias towards change, as well as wanting to generate conflict, was painfully apparent from almost immediately. And I think the challenge that folks did not appreciate is that the media is part of a system that supports a status quo. And so we represented a huge change from the status quo. The example is in 2022, when I was running for office, the media was not interested at all in what I had to say or covering our platform. But as soon as we got into office, we were deluged with media requests and requests for information. And there was just a slew of stories. And my photograph and my name became clickbait. And they did that intentionally. It helped both, it's a motivation for making money by creating the conflict, but it's also a reflection of the fact that most of the time, when you have a status quo prosecutor, the media is not actually getting their information from the prosecutor, they're getting it from the police. And so our administration was independent of the police forces and the unions that control the narrative around crime in most cities. And so the media had that narrative. And if you look back at the coverage, you can see how they placed anything that I said or did was placed in the context of the police narrative as if there was something suspicious and the public should be concerned about what we were doing.
Yeah.
So it was not helpful.
Yeah. Clickbait. Wow. Okay. That's that's interesting. Um, you said something earlier just about, your transition into office and how the department had several suicides prior to your transition in. And just from like a trauma informed perspective, how impactful do you think that was department wide? And how do you think it impacted your ability to, your transition in?
Well, as soon as we arrived in the office, within a matter of days, it was reported to me that people were sharing with my team the trauma that they had experienced in the office. One, from the number of suicides that they had experienced within the previous 4 years. There had been 3 suicides. And in 2020, a longtime member had suffered a heart attack, and his widow blamed my predecessor. And so there was a lot of trauma in the office. And every member of my leadership team, including myself, experienced a moment where you would walk into a room with someone or they'd come into the office with you and they just start crying. People would just break down on us. And I had that happen to me. And a woman literally fell into my arms and started crying as soon as I closed the door. And I said, "Well, what's wrong?" She said, "We've been waiting for you." And I said, "Well, how long have you been here?" And she said, 25 years. So you had a lot of senior people that were very traumatized by what the office had gone through before we got there. And even the lawyers had created their own mental health team to address some of the trauma that they had experienced. And so we immediately began to amplify that and to provide mental health support. We created, I brought a mental health psychologist with me. Licensed clinical psychologist came in the door with me, and she immediately set up office hours in her office. And we made that service available to people around the 9th floor at the RCD building. And across the organization, I had to tell my team, give them grace, because these folks are clearly have been overwhelmed by a lack of staffing, delayed plant maintenance. There were so many issues that you could tell had adversely impacted the workforce.
Mhm. Well, so hearing about the trauma impacted that the department had experienced prior to you coming, how do you think that that impacted your reform approach to justice as you entered office?
I think that as we entered the office, and the office was in that condition of trauma, a lot of fear, anxiety. They were unprepared for the change. The office, as I said, had not seen change in 50 years. But the expectation had been that my opponent, who had been a 30-year veteran in the office, was going to be the next district attorney. And so there was this assumption that, of course, things would not change and that he would be there, someone that they knew, they were familiar with. And so when that did not happen, that set off a whole chain reaction of fear and anxiety that then compounded the trauma that the organization had already been through. And as we found out in the organizational survey of employees, the understaffing The lack of technological support that one would expect in a modern law firm was just not there. And so I think that it made it difficult. It certainly made it more difficult for us to get a handle on what was happening and for people on the inside to really be able to express support for the things that we were doing.
Yeah. Despite the challenges that you encountered, you actually were able to make some real significant changes around reform. Just you reduced you reduced sentencing enhancements. You refused to charge juveniles as adults. You launched a public accountability unit for police misconduct. So, from a criminological perspective, what was the theory behind these changes, and how did they not translate in the spaces?
Well, I think they did translate. And I think, as I look back on it, people began the recall almost as soon as I was elected. And it wasn't what I was doing, it was what they were afraid of what I would do. That the changes that I talked about in my 10-point platform would actually come to fruition. And so, I take that as a compliment that people believe that I would do what I said I would do. And I'm proud of that, that I am not someone that says one thing and does another. And so they understood that, apparently respected me from my prior, the life that I've led and the work that I've done. So they were afraid that I was actually going to do what I said I was going to do. And so as we started those things, certainly there was resistance, as we've talked about on the inside, from lawyers who were not prepared to accept the changes. And then on the outside, there were people who were fearful of what we were going to do. And so we didn't have enough time to do all of the things that I committed to do. We did end the death penalty, and we walked into a situation where we actually were able to expose how the death penalty had been imposed in an unconstitutional manner and an unethical manner for 30 years out of this office. And that was deeply embedded in the psyche of the office, the cover up of that. And it expanded beyond the office because many of the lawyers who were in the office at that time during that 30-year period were now judges in Alameda County. Some of them had prosecuted those cases, some of them had presided over those cases. And so we shined a light on some deep, dirty practices that people didn't want to have come out.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because you talk about being embedded into practice. 30 years is a long time, right? And it is hard to change, especially in the light of, or in light of, light and the possibilities that existed. I hear you when you said that they were fearful. Yeah, they scared. They was scared. They knew it was coming and they could see it happening. And so I'm glad that you were able to at least start in that direction.
Yeah. I mean, our direction was based on the law. The law started changing in California as much as, a decade before I got there. The rules on sentence enhancements changed long before we got there. And then SB 81, which passed in 2022, mandated that judges stop using enhancements. The felony murder rule was changed. In fact, the resentencing laws were passed and were in effect. So the tools were there. It was just a question of would you have someone come into the office that was prepared to implement those changes. And I think that our opponents saw this is the law now, and I did have a legal basis to move forward in the way that we did, and that scared them.
Mhm. And I'm glad that you actually mentioned that because I think, people are fixed. They have their ideas about what it should be, right? And everybody can quarterback on Monday or, what I'm saying, following the game. But just really seeing that you were responsive to the changes in law. I think sometimes the perception was that you were coming in and changing the law.
Right.
So I'm glad that you put that in perspective, and really, were responsive to the progress that was being had,
Right.
or at least the attempts at it.
Right. Well, I mean, one of the things that is ironic people were upset about the fact that some of my critics were like, she believes in restorative justice. We can't have that. Well, guess what? The law now mandates that in a prosecutorial situation, prosecutors have a requirement under the law to advise victims that there are restorative justice opportunities available to them in the community. And you have to be able to identify those. That's the law. And so the DA is supposed to be implementing that law because it is the law.
Yeah. All right. Restorative justice. I know it's been a rally cry for some. It's been a point of contention for others. But as you stated, the laws have changed to really support that movement.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a hot button issue, but I didn't make that issue up. That is the law now. And, we were just barely scratching the surface to provide restorative justice options to people who wanted them. And we encountered so many victims that had been in the system for years, had lost a loved one, and told us that they had asked for restorative justice and been told, oh, there's no such thing. Well, that was a lie. And so we had to start to create, that was one of the projects that we were working on that essentially got stymied by the recall.
All right. Well, kind of speaking along these lines, right? We're talking about the restorative justice model, but let's be clear. This was the district attorney, right? So she prosecuted murders at a higher rate than her predecessor. Yet the public perception was that you were soft on crime. I remember like seeing news articles and referring to you as an auntie. As an auntie myself, I'm offended as if it's a negative thing. But I just want you to kind of speak to that. Like your office really was tough on crime, following the new mandates and rules. Yet there was this kind of duality in perception. And how do you feel about that, or why do you think that that existed?
Yeah, I think the duality in perception, again, is the media bias against us. I mean, the reality is we were prosecuting crimes at a higher rate. Plea bargains are 98% of the way that cases get disposed of. If you don't do plea bargains, the system will shut down. And so we weren't doing anything dramatically different from my predecessor other than what the law required, which is that you have to look at the use of enhancements. You have to look at the Racial Justice Act. You have to look at what are the restorative justice options. You have to look at colorblind charging. All of these mandates that came from the legislation that we were bringing into effect, which had not been followed or implemented in my office. But at the same time, we were doing every day, sending lawyers, 150 lawyers going to court, prosecuting people. The majority of cases prosecuted in the office are misdemeanors. People don't report, the media doesn't cover or report misdemeanors. They cherry pick a few felony cases and make it all about that. And that was just the bias that we faced. And the derogatory references to me as a Black woman is just embedded in racism. There is a racial bias against Black women in the media, and we get all sorts of labels and, micro aggressions that we saw that other people aren't subjected to. And it permeates the mainstream media, the community forums, on Nextdoor. I mean, it's all over the place. As a Black woman, I was subjected to that.
Yeah. Yeah. And walking in a Black woman's shoes myself, I can definitely understand what that looks like. I do want to kind of shift this a little bit because, we are talking about your work in the office, but I want to talk about your work overall. Your life reads like a Hollywood story, an American, starting from the bottom all the way to the top.
Right.
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 And so, I mean, if you can kind of just talk about how your experience prior to really shaped your approach to your office, to your position, and even like what you're doing moving forward.
Right. Yeah, I mean, started from the bottom. Now we're here. The song, how we people sang that when we won in 22. I'm a former foster kid. I'm a survivor of the Ohio juvenile justice and the foster care system. As a young person, I was active in the civil rights movement. I was incarcerated for a year after I was arrested in a civil rights demonstration. I lived through all of that. I've literally made it from the streets of Cincinnati to Yale College, literally by the grace of God. And then going to Yale and getting involved there as one of the early classes of women at Yale. I got involved in the movement to make Title IX a reality. I became the lead plaintiff in the first Title IX case to establish that sexual harassment in education, it's two things. One, sexual harassment in education is illegal, which wasn't true in 1977 when I joined Alexander versus Yale. But also, the second thing was that because we filed the lawsuit, we gave another tool to people. Nobody had sued under Title IX up to that point. And so we created a legal remedy for people that folks are using now across the board. And so I was blessed to be, really just thrown into that situation. And it was challenging. I was 20 years old and I said, this man sexually propositioned me, and Yale did not want to hear about that. And at that time, sexual harassment didn't have a name when we filed that lawsuit in 1977. And so to be at the tip of the spear of that movement was a growing experience for me as well as a young woman. And then having the opportunity to come to California, go to UC Berkeley, graduate from law school, pass the California bar, and then become a practicing lawyer for 30 years and representing everyday people. Big cases, little cases. I started off early suing the California Department of Corrections on behalf of women working inside the correctional system and understanding that those are good jobs, to be able to go to work for CDCR and you only have to have a high school diploma. And if you're a single mom or a working woman, that's a good job. And so fighting for women to be able to have those jobs on an equal basis with men became a crusade, really. Did a lot of CDCR cases. They were happy when I got elected to be the DA. They're like, oh, she's gone now. But spent, 30 years doing that from 1991 to 2016, really. So I brought a lot of life experiences. One of the things that I wanted prosecutors to understand is one thing to prosecute someone. But you need to understand what that means, how that impacts that person, where they're going for when you send them away for 25 years to life. What does that system look like? How does that impact their family? In Alameda County, we have a lot of intergenerational trauma caused by mass incarceration because a lot of people went to jail from the drug wars and from the over-prosecution of Black and brown communities, and their families, their children, their parents, their sisters, and their brothers were all impacted by that. And I thought that that was an important perspective that we never really got to share with the prosecutors because they were so resistant to that. And also being a victim of prosecutorial overreach myself, I was a victim of domestic violence. I was in an abusive situation when my daughter was just born. And I was in that situation. I ended up being arrested and then prosecuted by the very DA's office that I then had the privilege to lead. And so I brought that perspective from a victim's perspective that, prosecutors have to have compassion.
That was a great answer. I just want to say, I'm like, I felt like I rode the wave from foster youth to Yale to Title IX to where you stand now. And as an educator, I'm very familiar with Title IX and all the institutions that I've ever worked in. That is a major deal. So thank you for being a pioneer in enacting that.
Yeah,
That's awesome. Yeah.
we made that law real. We gave Title IX a meaning, a definition, a life, and it continues to impact education across the country. Now, again, we're in a fascist situation where the Trump administration wants to is in the process of eliminating the Department of Education, and they are the main guardians of Title IX. And so that's a real threat for women everywhere, both in education as well as employment.
Yeah. Might be time to put them boots on the ground, round two. Madam Price, some critics pointed to plea deals and sentencing decisions that they felt were too lenient. Supporters said that you were correcting decades of over incarceration. Can you give us an example of where you feel your approach was vindicated?
Well, as a prosecutor and as a lawyer, you have to look at each case individually. And so we weren't making prosecutorial decisions based on decades of misconduct. Certainly, that was the backdrop that we were aware of. And I think anyone coming into Alameda County DA's office as a leader should know what the history is, whether it's something they read about or something as I personally experienced how the prosecutor overreach was there, and that overreach was overcharging, making decisions whether or not to charge and how to charge people based on race, based on gender. And so we certainly took a hard line on that, that we weren't going to tolerate any other discriminatory um, basis for charging, and that we would root that out wherever we could. But ultimately, whether or not to charge an enhancement or how a case should be charged is based on a number of different factors specific to that case. What's the evidence in the case? What's the ability to prove the case? Can you prove it beyond a reasonable doubt? Should always be is the first basic standard. And so we were certainly looking at a lot of situations where unfortunately that wasn't true, that you could look at at a case and say you're not going to be able to prove this beyond a reasonable doubt. What is the actual charge that should be in this case? And so we were vindicated in a number of cases. The Logwood case was one of the high profile cases that we were actually vindicated in, because when we assigned a different prosecutor to take a look at the case and an investigator, they found that there were charges that could not be proven. And it took a lot of courage for that prosecutor to come to me and say, Madam DA, we can't prove this. We have incarcerated this young man for 8 years, and we don't have the evidence to prove it. And in fact, there's evidence that suggests that he did not commit two of these murders. And so we presented that to the court. It wasn't well covered in the media, but certainly that was a vindication. Another high profile case was the Kevin Nishida case, which we discovered was mischarged, where the wrong person had been charged for actually shooting at Kevin Nishida and killing him. And in fact, it was a different person. There were 3 people involved in the crime. We evaluated the evidence, and ultimately, the DA who had been responsible, assigned to prosecute the case, had to come back to me after our initial conversations about the case and some further investigation, and admitted that they had mischarged the case and that we needed to charge the third person, who was actually not in custody at that time, with the actual shooting of Kevin Nishida. So it happened a number of times. There's a case most recently, the California Court of Appeal issued an order to show cause to the Superior Court on some questions around prosecutorial misconduct. But one of the things that the court did was strike 2 of the enhancements that had been prosecuted by our office, by my former office, and approved by the judge in that case. And the Court of Appeal said these enhancements are not legal. They should not have been used, and we're going to strike them. And so we saw that over and over again, that there was a need to review not only the cases individually with, a good eye, but the practices to try to get underneath it so that it stopped and you wouldn't have these cases coming back years later after they go through the appellate process and then the case gets overturned.
Right. Well, I'm glad that you gave some perspective on that, because I know that those are cases that we have seen in the news. Oftentimes you hear the initial case sensationalism, but you don't hear the follow through or what happened at the end. So thank you for informing me and everybody about what happened.
Yeah.
Um, Speaking of cases and continuing kind of in the same direction, I really want to talk about the Maurice Monk case. I know that you launched investigations into the sheriff's dealings about this case. And this all happened before you left office. So, what did you discover about accountability mechanisms in Alameda County?
Well, for the sheriff, the only real accountability mechanism is the district attorney. The sheriff conducts their internal investigations, and we've seen the results of that in some situations. But often the only external investigation, which should be independent, is the investigation conducted by the DA's office. And the sheriff is an elected official, just like the DA. And so the sheriff doesn't report to the Board of Supervisors. The sheriff is a constitutional officer. And so the only real authority or mechanism for accountability for misconduct inside the sheriff's department is from the DA's office. And so we took that charge very seriously. I believe a lot more seriously than any of my predecessors. And we're well aware, certainly when we came into office, of the long history of unfortunate deaths, uninvestigated and unaccountable deaths in Santa Rita County Jail. Certainly for years, one newspaper reported that Santa Rita County Jail was the most dangerous place to be in Alameda County, and we lead the state in the number of in custody deaths. And, if there's a problem and nobody's addressing the problem, then the problem will just continue and probably get worse. And so what we saw, knowing how big this problem was, we knew that there had been a lack of accountability for decades. And so we took a lot more serious look at when someone died in custody in Alameda County, and particularly, obviously, the Maurice Monk case was something that was in the news and was pretty egregious and had not been addressed by my predecessor. And so we took that opportunity to do that. And when we did, we found not only Maurice Monk's case, but a case that I charged before that. Vanetta Martin was a young Black woman who was incarcerated in Santa Rita and had a history of mental illness and was on under mental health care and was left alone. And committed suicide. At least that's what the story was. And we charged deputies who appeared to us to have falsified the records of how they monitored her condition. And, for me, Vanetta Martin was Alameda County's Sandra Bland. And I knew that we had a problem. And so I wasn't surprised when my team looked at the problems in the Maurice Monk case, and we felt compelled to file that case not only against the deputies, which certainly the sheriff was not very happy with that, sure, not having had accountability forever, to now have us holding those those deputies accountable, as well as WellPath, the healthcare provider. There was evidence of misconduct by the doctors and the nurses.
Wow. I didn't know about the lack of checks and balances for the sheriff's office and like the pivotal role that the DA's office plays in maintaining that power, right, dynamic, and really that oversight and supervision.
Right.
So thank you for informing about that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I have another question around kind of your service implementation and your responses, but this is more so from the community perspective and working with victims. So your office created the first ever Victim Advisory Commission. This is very counterintuitive to what critics say or were saying about your lack of response to victims. How do you reconcile progressive prosecution with victim advocacy?
Progressive victim advocacy is at the heart of progressive prosecution. We are the ones that actually recognize that the system does not treat victims properly. That victims for decades, as long as in the traditional prosecutorial model, victims are just tools and they don't get the respect and the services that they should have, that they need in your traditional DA's offices. And so every progressive prosecutor, the model that we have followed and the people that I know in the movement, we've all been very committed to serving victims and improving the experience of victims in the administration of justice. For instance, my office, we were in the middle before the recall of using technology, implementing a system where victims could get text messages. It's often victims come to court, they get a notice, okay, or somebody tells them this person who committed this crime against your loved one or against you is going to be in court on this day. And then the court date gets changed and nobody tells them. And so we were trying to create a system where there would be an automatic text message sent out to victims and their families to know that if a court date changes. Another issue is when people are told to come to court and there's no, again, it's no court. And then they're told the clerk, just they go to the clerk, they go to court, they sit there for hours, then it doesn't show up on the calendar. And then the clerk says, well, it hasn't been filed. Go to the DA's office. And so they go to the DA's office and the DA, our reception would say, take a message, and nobody gets back to them. I mean, just the way victims are treated overall in the criminal justice system is atrocious. And as someone who was a victim, I knew that firsthand for 30 years ago. So I think it's very much part of what we're trying to do to make the system more responsive to our communities, because I think part of the flaws in the traditional prosecutorial model is that the DA's office is not reflective of the community that it serves. And certainly Alameda was no difference. This DA's office is very, very insulated from the communities that it serves. There's no community outreach. I mean, our Victims Advisory Board was one element of our ability to connect the community with the office. We also established a mental health commission so that people whose loved ones are being prosecuted who have mental health issues now have a voice in how we do that. We created a reentry commission so that people who are reentering our community from the criminal justice system, that there are advocates there that could tell district attorneys what do we need to do to make sure that people don't recidivism and that they don't reoffend again and cause a public safety crisis again. And so those are all initiatives. If you look at a prosecutor who comes from the community and is invested in the community, that makes a difference.
Yeah. Well, I definitely hear that in your response. I mean, I think just having that point of reference as a victim navigating a system and then being in charge of a system that is, you know, designed to respond to victims' needs. It's great that you had the insight and were able to use those lived experiences to help devise the way that you would service victims.
Well, let me be clear. The system as it exists is not designed to respond to victims' needs. The system is designed and has been designed from a racialized perspective to punish Black and brown people. That's how the system evolved. And where victims are Black and brown, the system is not designed to support them in that. For instance, our Victims Advocates Division, the majority of people who are being served or victims in Alameda County are Black, brown, or Asian. We found a victims advocates workforce that lacked diversity. They didn't have any persons of Asian descent that speak Cantonese or Mandarin when we got there. We had to hire folks for that. They didn't have enough African American advocates to really be able to connect with African American victims in their worst moment. I've represented people for 30 years in their worst moments. And so I understand the impact that trauma has and the care that folks need. And they weren't getting it from this office or any prosecutor's office. The prosecutor's office is focused on the prosecution and punishment and incarceration. That is the theme of every prosecutor's office. And if a community wants to have justice with compassion that reflects the needs of victims and provides victim services, you have to have someone from the community who is leading that office.
Yeah. Yeah. That was really powerful. It just took me aback for a minute, just kind of like really hearing that. I teach criminal justice and forensic classes, and I tell my students all the time the victims are like the last people that we often consider. We think about the process and the laws and who needs to be there and the rights that people have and but at the end of the day, even though they're the main reason, they often get like the short end of the stick. So it is good to hear about the efforts that were being set forward to really support victims in those spaces.
Yeah.
And just hearing about how you brought in the diversity needed, right? And it's not just the diversity, but it's the lived experience, it's the ability to speak languages, to connect, to have a central point of, connectivity with our victims and being intentional in bringing those advocates in. That's actually, the good work continues, right?
Yeah.
And so good. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. I do want to say, like, so the momentum is going, right? The things were happening. The office was changing. 30 years of embedded culture was starting to evolve, right? We were starting to see, like, a lot of positive things starting to emerge from the office. So in that moment, right after the first year, you had so many different accomplishments. So where it seems like you had actually found your footing and we were going to be moving forward. So what do you think was the shift or the change in public perception?
Yeah. I think that you're right. The office was after that first year, when we hit January of 2024, I felt confident that we were on the right track. We had hired 200 people, over 100 at that time. So we were filling the staff vacancies. We had diversified the office, and that was having an impact. We had spent a lot of time on the plant management. I appointed a facilities manager so that we were bringing the facilities. We had 10 different offices, and we were bringing those facilities up to make it a welcoming space, not only for victims, but for the people who actually work there. And so we were doing a lot. I think that Oakland was in crisis, no question about it. In 2023, Oakland experienced a crisis of its law enforcement operation, the apparatus there. The mayor and the chief fell out almost in January of 2023. The mayor got rid of the police chief. And so you had a police department that essentially had an interim leader and a new mayor, and it was struggling. At the same time, there was really a brief uptake in crime. And so, I had to remind people that for all of 2023 and half of 2024, we didn't have a police chief in Oakland. That makes a difference. And so people were looking at me as if I was the mayor of Oakland or if I had control over the police department, which I did not. And so that really turned the tide, I think, that there was so much going on in Oakland, so much lack that they lacked, that they focused, the opposition was able to focus and say, well, it's her fault. I got blamed for every carjacking, every business closing, even the graffiti, every serious and small crime, everything that normally in a city of the size of Oakland is handled by the police department and the local administration. And so with that focus being on the problems of Oakland, it steamrolled into making me accountable for all of that. And then ultimately it was a political argument. It was very political.
Yeah. Well, I can appreciate you sharing that because I think sometimes we don't realize that without a police chief, right, the level of chaos that ensues.
Right.
And again, being at the end of the pandemic where we were already experiencing strife and trauma, and then to come into this space and there's no real identified leader.
Right.
Um,
And you have for a year and a half. A year and a half. I did not meet the new police chief until May of 2024. That's when he finally got around. I met with LaRon Armstrong, the old police chief, in January of 2023. And we talked about a number of pressing issues in Oakland. The sex trafficking, that I know you supported our efforts on that. That situation was already out of control. LaRon Armstrong shared with me how challenging that was and the intersectionality of gun violence and human trafficking that was exploding in the San Antonio neighborhood. And that was in January. And then he was gone. And we did not get a chief in Oakland until May of 2023. And when he came, he wasn't even licensed to be a chief in California. So he had to go through a program. So Oakland was in crisis in terms of its law enforcement. And this is a department that has been under federal consent decree for 22 years. So it is already a department that is shaky, okay, and needs leadership. And so there was a lot going on that was missing for Oakland residents. And the opposition was able to exploit that and point the finger at me.
Yeah. Well, kind of speaking of that, the opposition and their stance and their, coming in, um, you know, just looking at the finances, so the recall campaign raised over $2.6 million compared to the 30,000 that you were able to amass. They had backing from many police unions, business leaders, and even your predecessor, the former DA Nancy O'Malley. Did the sheer scale of opposition surprise you?
I don't think, no, I was not surprised by the sheer scale of the opposition. I was surprised, but because we've seen this, the money, I've seen it in Oakland where there was an effort several years ago to buy the at-large city council seat. And we saw increasingly in Oakland, we've seen, mega amounts of money being spent to buy these seats. So I wasn't surprised by that. And it's true across country. Jose Garza, the elected DA in Travis County, Texas. Elon Musk spent millions of dollars on his trying to stop his reelection. So we knew that millions do flow into different cities around these issues. I think what was surprising, what we did not anticipate, was the way that the media essentially bought into everything that they were saying and amplified it. That's what was surprising, that you could not see we couldn't get a fair coverage. People were not getting real information, accurate information from the media. That everything, once they started latching on to the recall, that everything we did was framed in the context of the recall. So if I charged someone, with anything, there was always, well, and she's being recalled. They added that.
Yeah.
So it undermined everything that we were trying to do.
Yeah. All right. So you have had, several months now. We're in 2025. Just reflecting back on 2023, what would you do differently?
I think when we came into the office, we did not appreciate how the communications department, which didn't exist, or how the folks that were there at that time were not helpful. We needed a real communications department. We didn't expect, like I said, nobody talked to us in 2022. And so my communications director was overwhelmed when we got there, and suddenly there was this deluge of information, and there was no support for him in that situation. And so we really needed to move more quickly to address the deficiencies in the communications apparatus that the DA's office had. Just the ability to have a press conference was challenging because you couldn't have cameras in the courthouse, and there was no infrastructure for communications either internally or externally. So we really needed to address that, I think, much earlier. Um, I think that a lot of the resistance that we have from prosecutors was again driven by their fear of the unknown. And if I had had more of an opportunity to meet more of the prosecutors where they were, I had asked my predecessor when I met with her, can you take me to the different facilities? There's Wiley Manuel Courthouse, there's the Renee Davidson Courthouse, there's the Echo J East County Hall of Justice. There's the Fremont Courthouse. So we have 5 major facilities where lawyers exist, and the juvenile justice, the juvenile department is in a whole nother location. And so if I had had more time, I wish I would have had more opportunity to go to each one of those locations and meet the people ahead of time, more certainly before I got there, but even in those early months, I think that we could have reassured them perhaps that I'm not this demon-headed woman who's out to get everybody.
Yeah. Well, just a real transition.
Mhm.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
So now to kind of discuss where you are now, right? We got a great overview of the origins, the work that you've done, your civic justice duties.
Yeah.
And now, you have launched a podcast entitled Pamela Price Unfiltered. So have you also returned to civil rights practice?
I have returned to practice, not focusing on civil rights. I'm now focusing on business and counseling small and medium businesses like what I did. And my original practice was a business practice. So I have a lot of wisdom, knowledge, and experience on how businesses should be organized. And so I'm developing that practice now.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what is discussed on Pamela Price Unfiltered? So our audience can be tuned in and dialed in, and what insights can they learn?
Sure. Pamela Price Unfiltered is a raw podcast with raw conversation about law, politics, education, systemic racism, cultural events, current events shaping our world. This is a complex world right now, and things are all over the place, and you can't find reliable information. And so I wanted to create a platform that would give people reliable information about what is happening both locally and nationally, and help folks navigate the complexities of all the information that we're receiving, and all of the things that are happening right now. It's a very complex, rapidly changing world. We're in information overload. And so it's very few places that you can go and get a really deep dive and a perspective on some story that you may have heard about. And obviously, very able to provide that perspective on the Alameda County criminal justice system and Alameda County generally.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
Yeah.
check it out, everybody.
Yeah.
I definitely
Yeah.
will be following and continue to follow that as well.
I hope so. We're on YouTube where you can watch it, and also on Substack where you can read the weekly word, and wherever you get your podcast. We're on all the stations: Apple, iHeart, Amazon. So it's audio as well as visual, as well as written. I am a writer. I love to write. And so I bring that gift to the people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All the gifts, right? All the gifts you bring in. Yes.
Yeah.
One final question. Wanted to ask you about your successor, Ursula Jones Dixon. So she has already reversed many of the initiatives that you implemented under your administration. How do you view these changes, and what do you think they mean for criminal justice in Alameda County?
So I will say that the public really hasn't gotten a full uh, view of all the things that have been reversed by the new district attorney, because the level of media scrutiny that we faced is not being given to her. And so there's a lot of things internally that are happening that have yet to be revealed. And what we do know is that she came in and has expressed that she felt she had a mandate from the 4 votes that she got from the Board of Supervisors to actually undo everything that we did. And that seems to be the central mission of the office right now, is to go back to where it was under Nancy O'Malley and where it was under Tom Orloff, which really was a very sad place. And I don't know that it's an office that she came out of, so she was familiar with the prior administrations before she became a judge, and obviously became a judge with the support of my predecessors. But I think that what the public should understand is that the office has changed since, you know, uh, O'Malley and Orloff were there, that the laws have changed. And so the effort to go back and turn back the clock, I think ultimately will fail. And it's a disservice to the residents of Alameda County. We need to go forward. We want the administration of justice to be improved. And so I would hate to see them undo the technological advances that we made, for instance, in terms of tracking cases. The public dashboard that we created, unfortunately, has been removed from public access. It took us a year to build the dashboard so the community could look and see how many cases are we receiving? How are those cases being charged? What is the disposition? Being able to follow cases. That kind of information that the media was clamoring for all of my first year, which we then provided, and then the new DA immediately took it away. That's a disservice to the community. The gun violence initiatives that we started, that we were just about to really move forward with the Department of Public Health. We did a gun violence report, which we released in November of 2024, and my predecessor has essentially discarded that effort. That's a danger to public safety when you don't take the progress that we made on gun violence and try to build on that. And so when you come into a situation where your only perspective and your only objective is let's undo what my predecessor did, kind of like what Trump has done with Biden. It's like we just got to undo everything. We're going to have executive orders the first day. And she started, signing directives the first day without really looking at how the advances that we made actually improve the administration of justice. And so I'm hoping that there will be a resetting once they figure out, or if they can decide, okay, we've undone everything that she did. Now maybe we can move forward and start really having a vision for how justice is administered. But it does need to be a vision that's rooted in community. And I think that's what has always been missing and what we brought to the table.
Nice. All right. Well, this was a fabulous interview, very informative, and I really do appreciate your time. I want to thank you for being here, and just if there's any last parting words that you want to share with the audience, here is your platform.
Well, thank you for having me. I just want to remind people that our election in 2022 was a watershed moment for Alameda County to become the first elected district attorney in Alameda County since 1938 was a huge victory for the people. And in 2024, we saw not only the backlash against me, but across the country, a threat to our democracy. And that threat is very, very real. It's national, it's local, and the ability of the people to select their district attorney based on a consideration of the merits of the candidates is a very precious, precious right. And I don't know that we'll get to exercise that right again anytime soon. But I want us to remember that it is part of fighting for our democracy, and that democracy does require the voice of the people to be respected and to be given an opportunity.
All right, nice. Well, sage words of wisdom from my guest here today, Madam Pamela Price. To our listeners, this conversation reminds us that behind every political battle are human beings trying to navigate complex systems while serving their communities. The future of criminal justice reform may depend on how we learn from these experiences, both the good and the bad. I challenge each of you to take this information into your communities, whether it's through advocacy, volunteering, or simply educating yourself and those around you. You can make a difference. Thank you for tuning in to Want More with Dr. Moore, the criminologist of the Bay. If you found this information insightful, please be sure to comment, like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, educate, empower, and enact the changes you want to see. Want more.
Want more with Dr. Moore, the criminologist of the Bay? Follow us on Facebook at Want More, Instagram at Want More Dr. Moore, and on TikTok at Want More with Dr. Moore for more information. Be sure to comment, like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, educate, empower, and enact the changes you want to see. Want more.